This is going to be a rather long video, so bear with me. It's a passion project of sorts, as I talk about my favourite game franchise of all time, Silent Hill. You may remember way back when I did a review of Silent Hill 2, and to this day I'm still rather proud of it. Silent Hill seems to bring out the best in me in terms of creativity, and there's a reason for this. It truly is, in my opinion, one of the most important gaming franchises in the history of the medium. Its depth, creativity, and genre-defining character cannot be understated. Yet, the last true Silent Hill game was 2012's Downpour, which means a whole 8 years have passed since the last full release. Yes, there was of course the brilliant demo PT, but it was, when all is said and done, merely a demo. Whilst PT was fantastic and hinted at a brave new direction for the franchise, it wasn't a true Silent Hill game. It just contained elements that would appear in the now cancelled Hideo Kojima horror Silent Hills. So, 8 years have passed, and the survival horror's golden age has all but come and gone. With the exception of the Resident Evil remakes, which have been excellent, survival horror has strayed far from its roots, now being the same take on a first-person game of hide and seek. Times have changed, and so has demand. But with rumours rife of a soft reboot of the Silent Hill franchise, assembled by the original team, which is amazing news if it's true, I would like to talk about why I believe Silent Hill is so valuable to gaming. Why I believe you cannot have a conversation about the history of gaming without mentioning Silent Hill. To do this requires some history and context, which I'll spend quite some time on. But if the rumours of a PS5 reboot are true, then new players who may not be old enough to remember the original games could gain a lot from a discussion of how the franchise came together. It's for these reasons I'll chart the progression of the Silent Hill development timeline. The first game began its development cycle way back in 1996. Capcom had a major success with their zombie survival horror Resident Evil, and Konami desired to develop their own take on it. They wanted a true, Hollywood-esque survival horror game to compete with the Resident Evil franchise and, knowing Konami, to make them a ton of money. Hence, Team Silent were put together. But there were issues. Team Silent was put together by Konami from staff who were failing in other projects and wanted to leave the company anyway. The team members felt increasingly as though Konami's profit-driven model wasn't for them. Also, they really had no idea how to approach developing a survival horror that was Hollywood. Being Japanese, they only really had access to American tropes through pop culture references, but this would become one of the game's major strengths. Referencing Stephen King, the film Jacob's Ladder, and the TV series Twin Peaks, Team Silent began to develop a picture of small-town America that they could work with. Konami even enlisted the young Takayoshi Sato to perform basic tasks. However, he wound up handling a lot of the 3D modelling, teaching his superiors the basic principles. He cites having lived in the Konami building to fix mistakes his superiors had made and render models over 150 computers after they had left for home. He remains uncredited by Konami for his modelling contributions during this period. However, he did render a short demo movie he had created and took it to Konami's higher-ups, threatening to withhold his technical expertise from the game's development if they did not allow him to work on the 3D models. Konami gave in. Sato then began to develop the game's characters as he developed the models, rather than working from sketch. The head honchos at Konami were unhappy with the project and sort of just stopped lending credence to it. This, mixed with the fact that Team Silent were having difficulties accommodating Konami's goals for the game, actually led to the artistic freedom these developers had yearned for. Whilst Konami was simply ignoring the game's development, Team Silent decided to focus on emotion and fear rather than gore and cinematics. They decided that their principal aim would be for their game to create an absolute fear of the unknown. Contrast this approach with Silent Hill's main competitor at the time, Resident Evil, where the fear and horror in the game was conveyed by what presents itself in front of you. Silent Hill took a different approach, instead opting to obscure the town in fog or darkness and making use of Akira Yamaoka's penchant for ambient sound design. There were technical reasons for this as well. The PlayStation had a very limited draw distance, and faults or irregularities in the game world would have been exposed. By enshrouding the town of Silent Hill in fog, you could circumvent the issues with draw distance and create the impression that the town is actually much larger than it is. The team now had a consistent vision which was free from Konami's money-driven meddling, and the development of Silent Hill began proper. The game has a very simple premise. You play as Harry Mason, taking his daughter Cheryl on a holiday to the lakeside resort of Silent Hill. After swerving to avoid hitting a figure in the road, Harry loses control of his car, crashes and passes out. Upon waking up, he finds Cheryl is missing. Thus, he embarks on a horrific journey into Silent Hill to find her. Along the way, you gradually, albeit vaguely, unravel the mystery of the town, linked to its cultist roots and demonic presence. Not only did Silent Hill stand apart from other titles in the survival horror genre, it stood apart from all games, providing a visceral, emotional journey and focusing on making you, as a player, afraid of what may be lurking rather than what is actually present. Silent Hill was the earliest example of absence of assets in a game being used to garner a response from the player. Literally, there's nothing to be afraid of, but you're afraid because you believe there might be. It's possibility over actuality, absence over presence, the psychical over the physical. This dualism had not been seen in gaming before, and when Silent Hill finally dropped in 1998, it was met with huge critical acclaim for its innovation, and rightfully so. This notion was carried over and emphasised to new levels in 2001's Silent Hill 2. Development began in 1999, and the game added a new layer to its storytelling dualism: sex and death. It centred in on our desires and fears as human beings, lusting after someone and trying to avoid dying. Due to the success of the first game, Konami gave Team Silent a bigger budget and more creative freedom to explore a deeper story than the first game. You play as James Sunderland, a depressed widower beckoned to return to Silent Hill through a letter from his dead wife, Mary. The game's plot is unrelated to the first game, focusing instead on James's journey of self-punishment over the death of his wife and his deep-seated sexual desires. The story touches on taboo in a way that games had never done before: abuse, incest, marital issues, illness and insanity. Silent Hill 2 is considered one of the greatest games ever developed, and tank control issues aside, if you've seen my review of the game, you'll know it stands as number 1 on the list of my favourite games. For Silent Hill 2, lead writing and direction was handed to Takayoshi Sato, the 3D modeler from the first game. Sound design was again handled by Akira Yamaoka, and the artistic direction was handled by Masahiro Ito, though in total, around 50 people worked on the game. The more powerful hardware of the PS2 allowed the team to focus on creating more dynamic light and shadow effects, such as the prominent inclusion of the growth of a shadow as a monster approaches James, his torch beam casting a horrifying shape on the nearby surfaces. Sato threw himself into the animation, this time sketching the characters making various facial expressions before creating wireframes. He states not wanting to use motion capture for facial animations, as it cannot capture all the contortions in the face when one speaks or makes an expression. Instead, he animated all of it, though they did rely on mocap for the bodies. The game is once again based on an outsider's look at life in the United States. One brilliantly placed example of this is finding your first gun of the game in a shopping trolley, supposedly to represent the relative ease and accessibility of purchasing a firearm in the US. There are the ample references to American cinema and literature dotted around, as with the first game. The audio in Silent Hill 2 is on another level. Always striving to elicit emotion and reaction from the player, Yamaoka created chilling and melancholic scores, industrial noise, horrifying dissonance, and even tailor-made variations of the same footstep to make it clear that you're stepping on a different texture. Yamaoka also approached silence in a different way to many games, choosing choice moments to completely deaden the music so as to make the ambience of the scene more apparent. As he puts it, silence is also another way of producing sound. Silent Hill 2 was, like its predecessor, met with universal acclaim. Its groundbreaking approach to creating a psychological horror experience within the medium of a console game makes it a game I consistently revisit to remind myself, if I ever doubt it, that game development is an art form that many just have yet to master. Development of Silent Hill 3 and a title called Room 302 began alongside each other in 2001, soon after the release of Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 3 is a direct sequel to the first game, pitting you as protagonist Heather Mason, daughter of the first game's Harry Mason, as she is pulled into the cult's plot to birth a god. Silent Hill 3 is something of a coming-of-age story as a young girl grows into a woman. Unlike Silent Hill 2, the focus of the fear in the third game was more violent and blood-soaked. It was actually the first game to have walls bleeding or burning dynamically in real time. Less psychological and more in-your-face, Silent Hill 3 plays on gore and jump scares in a way that the previous titles didn't. However, it's never cheesy or over the top. The balance is still always there. Also, unlike the first two titles in the series, the majority of the game takes place indoors, with those lengthy exploration sections in the fog-shrouded town replaced with claustrophobic shopping malls and, of course, a hospital. In the same fashion as the other games, the emphasis on Silent Hill 3's design is emotional response, albeit in a different way this time. The plot is, in a lot of ways, much simpler than Silent Hill 2's tragic tale of love, lust and loss, but it is, in other ways, more traditionally scary. As with the first two games, Silent Hill 3 met with a positive reception upon release, although something was starting to become apparent. The third-person survival horror formula that has helped the series define the genre was becoming somewhat repetitive, and a major criticism of Silent Hill 3 was that it lacked any true innovation, something that cannot be said about Silent Hill 1 and 2. I mentioned that Silent Hill 3 was developed alongside another game, called Room 302. This would eventually become Silent Hill 4, The Room, and is a huge departure from the norms that the first three games established. It's a very strange game indeed. Firstly, it doesn't actually take place in Silent Hill, but instead in a nearby town called South Ashfield. A quiet man, Henry Townsend, becomes mysteriously trapped in his apartment and can only get out through a weird hole that suddenly appears in his bathroom. This hole leads him into the nightmare of various people who all appear dead in real life upon completion of a level. The game's combat deviates from the previous titles, featuring weapon durability and the introduction of ghost enemies, which can only be put down temporarily unless you burn a special candle. Your only safe space is the apartment you wake up in. However, at a certain point in the game, this space becomes infested with ghosts, and if you don't have any candles, you can take damage even here. Now, The Room was always intended to be a Silent Hill game, merely a very different one. Production was handled by sound designer and composer Akira Yamaoka. It's stated that The Room was purposely meant to frustrate the player, with unkillable enemies that can ceaselessly pursue you, weak and ineffective weapons, lots of backtracking, and levels that are hard to navigate. Despite all of this, The Room received generally positive reviews upon its release. However, I never enjoyed the fourth installment anywhere close to how much I adore the first three games. I always admire its attempt to be different and to take the game into new directions, and I can't help but think it's the one Silent Hill game that was a major influence on PT. But it's just never engaged me the way the older games did, and I see The Room as the true start of the downfall of the franchise. It was after The Room that Konami handed development of the Silent Hill series to other teams and disbanded Team Silent. The first of these attempts at carrying on the franchise was Climax Action's Silent Hill Origins. Situated as a prequel to the first game, Origins returns to the formula of the first three games as you play as Travis Grady, investigating the whereabouts of a girl he rescued from a fire a number of years earlier. It's not a bad game, but the developers had well-stated troubles with the game engine and the overall vision for the game. This all comes through, as Origins essentially wound up being a replica of the first game. The next in the list of externally developed Silent Hill games was Double Helix's Homecoming, which is overwhelmingly regarded by fans of the franchise, myself included, as the worst of the Silent Hill games. You play as Alex Shepard, a returning soldier coming home to find his hometown has been turned upside down and his younger brother missing. Practically everything about the game sucks. The plot is shallow and uninspired, the combat is a bunch of quick time events, and monsters are straight up pinched from previous games. The one redeeming thing about Homecoming is one of the bosses, Scarlet, which is, of my own admission, utterly terrifying. However, the game is hot garbage, so much so that the Japanese version of the game was cancelled. Jim Sterling calls Homecoming dickless, a sentiment I utterly agree with. A more positive release from a Western developer came with Climax Studios' Shattered Memories, a reimagination of the first game for the Nintendo Wii, following Harry Mason's quest to find his daughter. However, Shattered Memories has an emphasis on choice and avoidance of monsters rather than engaging in combat. The game's monsters morph and change depending on the choices you make throughout. After Shattered Memories came Downpour. Downpour was the first Silent Hill game not to feature sound design and composition from Akira Yamaoka, and instead Vatra Games went with the composer of the TV series Dexter, Daniel Licht. The story, following Murphy Pendleton upon escaping from jail, is pretty decent. The game was developed on the Unreal Engine and features an open-world, semi-quest based structure, which I quite enjoyed. The monsters were pretty uninspired, all being basically humans in bandages, but on the whole, I actually thought Downpour was pretty good. There are some genuinely great moments in this game, including putting together a stage show of Hansel and Gretel, only for the production to come to life with monsters, or terrifying chase sequences in which you find yourself having to avoid a ball of red light through ever more surreal mazes. That said, it received pretty mixed reviews upon release, generally because whilst there are great moments in this game, on the whole, it's fairly average. There was also the dungeon crawler, Book of Memories, developed by Way Forward Technologies for PS Vita. I didn't play that, so I couldn't possibly comment, although it did not perform well with critics. After all of these mixed attempts at keeping the franchise alive, Silent Hill sort of faded away. Survival horror didn't really go down well with the newer generation of gamer, instead favouring first-person shootouts and online multiplayer to a genuinely emotionally engaging psychological horror. You can see this at play in the way Capcom altered the Resident Evil series to first-person with Resident Evil 7. That said, the remakes have stayed true to the third person and are really very good. But one day, a mysterious demo appeared on the PlayStation Store, named PT, or Playable Teaser. Nothing was known about the game it was meant to tease, and a pseudonym was given to the developer. It was a first-person puzzle that took place within a house, with very limited rooms. A basement, a main square corridor, and a bathroom. Upon solution of the puzzle, which happened a lot quicker than was intended, the terrifying demo ended with Norman Reedus slowly making his way down the street of what turned out to be Silent Hill. That's right, PT was a demo for the next iteration of the Silent Hill series, Silent Hills, developed by none other than Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear Solid in collaboration with cinema director Guillermo del Toro. In the hands of Kojima Productions, Silent Hill was promised a breathtaking revival. It was even rumoured that horror manga artist Junji Ito was on board to provide the artwork. However, it was not meant to be. Kojima's well-documented fallout with Konami, which I won't go into here, led to the cancellation of the Silent Hills project, and in 2015, PT was pulled from the PlayStation Store. So much for the history and development of Silent Hill, and now on to what makes it such an important franchise. I can't sit here and claim that Silent Hill doesn't get the acclaim it deserves. It isn't an underrated franchise. Proof is in the fact that Silent Hill 2 regularly appears high up in various greatest games ever made lists. But I'm claiming that the Silent Hill franchise had an impact upon gaming in general. Also, it has to be said that Silent Hill did not innovate in the sense of gameplay. The tank controls and fixed camera angles of those original 3 games were very common at the time, especially within the survival horror genre. But the franchise innovated in other ways. Firstly, the plots. Silent Hill was the first game to truly touch the player in a deep and psychological way. Enjoying a game is not enough to claim to be touched by it. I enjoyed lots of games, but they never had the emotional impact of a Silent Hill game. Whether it's one man's quest to find his missing daughter in a twisted town, another man coming face to face with his deepest fears and desires, or a girl's transformation into a strong, independent woman, there's always something so human driving the protagonist on, in the face of such otherworldly and eldritch nightmares. Despite Silent Hill being such a warped town, there's always something utterly relatable in each of these games. In real life, we don't have to deal with cults or the supernatural, but we do have to deal with death, loss, confusion, anxiety, growth, despair, and a whole other range of dizzying emotions. Silent Hill was the first game to deal with this in any sort of coherent and convincing way. These early games were aided in their endeavour to provide an emotional experience by eliciting genuine fear in the player. Silent Hill was not the first horror game. It was predated by titles like Sweet Home, Clock Tower, Alone in the Dark, and of course, Resident Evil. But what set Silent Hill apart was its completely radical new approach to scaring the player. Gore and violence were de-emphasised, traditional Hollywood-esque musical scoring was replaced with ambience and industrial drone, and jump scares were substituted in favour of suspense and tension. What's more, Silent Hill scared because it tapped into our inbuilt fear of the unknown and our subconscious drives. The original Team Silent expertly crafted games which scared us because deep down there was again something grounded and human about the whole affair. Characters, including the protagonists, had flaws. This was especially the case in Silent Hill 2, where James is, as you come to realise, not a very good person. He's tortured by guilt and confusion. You simply didn't see this in games until Silent Hill 2 came along. Fear was not the end goal for Team Silent, but the device itself. Taking inspiration from artists such as Bacon, Rembrandt and others, Masahiro Ito's monstrous creations broke new ground. Moving in a completely different direction to other games, especially horror games, the norms and conventions set by earlier titles were totally eschewed. Instead, and in keeping with the idea that there's something human in the midst of the nightmare, Ito designed creatures that were highly symbolic. In Silent Hill 2, the idea of sex and death coming together was typified by the odd sex appeal of the nurses. Despite being rotting and deadly, they sport a low-button shirt and a high skirt. Similarly, the mannequins, which are 2 pairs of long female legs stitched together at the waist, emphasise this idea of being repulsed by and attracted to the creatures of Silent Hill. Of course, there's also the now iconic Pyramid Head, symbolic both of being the town executioner of times gone by and James's personal punisher, often engaged in sexual acts with other creatures. There are no clumsy zombies here or over-the-top flesh-torn enemies with numerous eyes, tentacles or claws. Instead, there are subtle, suggestive and downright creepy monsters which kind of resemble humans, but also something completely abnormal at the same time. So, what makes Silent Hill so important? Well, for a start, it changed the way we as players can view games. No longer just forms of blockbuster entertainment, games became an art, capable of tapping deep into the human psyche and manipulating our innermost fears and desires. Similar to Hollywood films, you can sit back and watch all the explosions and high action sequences you want, but this cannot replace the feeling you get when you come to the end of a Lynch film. You can dance to the most repetitive and rhythmic of beats, however, you cannot feel the way you feel when you listen to a truly great piece of music. You can admire the bright colours of graffiti, but you don't get the same lasting impression as you do when you stare at the darkness of Goya's black paintings. Silent Hill proves that video games can be artistic when developed by masters of the craft. People who care less about making money and more about understanding the relationship a player has with the medium they're playing. And that's the point. The narrator in the Making of Silent Hill 2 documentary refers to Team Silent as masters of emotion, and that's precisely what they are. Going forward, the best games would always try to tap into the emotions of players, and whilst there had been games prior to Silent Hill that had emotional moments, none of them consistently made players feel such a wide range of emotions through one primary agent: fear. It's also easy to see how a lot of horror games since Silent Hill have ignored the lessons from Team Silent. A great many of them are still bombastic showcases of gore and over-the-top violence with no subtlety and no nuance. They're, to quote Jim Sterling again, dickless. This isn't the case with all horror games. Dead Space is a great survival horror, making one afraid of what could be lurking in the darkness. However, its completely personalityless protagonist and gore-ridden aliens make it ultimately an inferior horror game. Similarly, games like White Day and Amnesia ushered in a new wave of survival horror with a focus on stealth and evasion, but again, they never captured what made Silent Hill so incredible: the raw emotion. Those early Silent Hill games aren't just games, they're pieces of art. Whenever anyone tries to argue that video games are trivial and a waste of time, one can always refer to Silent Hill as an example of why they're dead wrong. Also, the way Team Silent developed their games made other developers realise that they could tell a gripping and emotional story through the medium of a video game, a trend that continues on to this day. In fact, it's become a hallmark of a great game to be able to not only have those emotional moments, but to elicit emotion consistently throughout its duration. Silent Hill did that, and it did it earlier and in a more convincing way than any other game before it. Even games like Mass Effect, whether the developers realise it or not, owe their storytelling and plot devices to games like Silent Hill. Team Silent paved the way for a new era of gaming, one which wasn't constrained by the confines of being a form of entertainment, one which was free to explore what makes us feel, and one whose legacy continues to ripple through gaming to this day.